Thank you so much for coming to our panel this afternoon, where our distinguished panelists are going to focus on African American history in Santa Clara County and really in San Jose, I would say, in a lot of ways. My name's Susan Anderson, and I was lucky enough to be on the planning committee for today's conference and have been a presenter. And I'm the history curator at the California African American Museum. And what we're going to do is I'm going to first let you know about our panelists. I have some biographical information on them. And then we're going to kick off the session with Dr. Michael Cheers from San Jose State University. He'll be followed by author and historian Jan Adkins. And we're actually going backward in history because we're going to end with Jean Libby, who's an author and historian. And I have to tell you, after years of knowing Jean, she's the foremost expert on John Brown, especially John Brown and his family in California. There's no one who's more knowledgeable than she is. So that's the order of our program, and I'd like to let you know that Michael Cheers is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at San Jose State. He's a Fulbright scholar, an award-winning photojournalist and documentary filmmaker. He got his got undergraduate and graduate degrees at Boston University and his doctorate at Howard University in Washington, D.C. I'm going to skip over all kinds of fascinating things about him, but he's been teaching at San Jose State University since 2006 as a faculty member, and he's focused his cameras on marginalized African American communities in San Jose, producing documentaries, newspaper articles, and other things. Right now, he's producing and directing This Far by Faith. That's an immersive digital humanities experience that uses virtual reality to explore the migration of the founders, congregants, and communities associated with San Jose's Black churches. What a great project. And his project reimagines the way history is taught by reclaiming ownership of the Black narrative, and I know exactly what you mean. There's a real difference in the quality of knowledge and observation when it comes from inside the experience and the culture itself. It can't be underestimated. Reclaiming ownership of the Black narrative. He's doing some fascinating work on his mentor, Gordon Parks. Would love to know more about that too, working in Paris. And his research demonstrates how capturing compelling images can engage communities and inspire deeper learning. It shows how digital communal photo projects can be used to unlock new ways of thinking, preserve memory, and ask questions that probe our understanding of history, identity, and the Black consciousness. He's worked for magazines, and I have left out some of the information about really fascinating work that he's done on the African continent in several stories. But he's going to be our first presenter. Then secondly, I'm just going to mention Jan Adkins. She's the author of African Americans of San Francisco, African Americans of Monterey County, and African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County. These were all published by Arcadia in the Images of America series between 2012-2019. And you know, these books are a result of this research that Jan does into primary sources, finding up to 200 images for each one of them in archives. She's also a writer, and I've read your thesis for my own research on African-American literary history. She looked at and did an analysis of literary prose and poetry that was published in African-American newspapers in San Francisco in the 19th century. Fascinating stuff. She has been a teacher. She taught English for San Jose Unified and Eastside Union High School districts from 1998 to 2014. She's also an associate faculty member at San Jose City College, teaching English literature, writing composition, and African American literature. She does a lot of lectures about her research and about these African American communities in the Bay Area, and she's a member, having been inducted into the Black Legends of Silicon Valley. You're in the presence of a Black legend of Silicon Valley for her research and publications about this community. She's on the board of the African American Heritage House, member of Santa Clara County Alliance of Black Educators, and so on and so forth. And lastly, Jean Libby is a retired instructor for U.S. History and Ethnic Studies. She worked at various community colleges throughout Northern California. She has written, edited, and published widely on John Brown, the abolitionist, and his family in California. In the 60s, she wrote and published periodicals for civil rights organizations, Mid-Peninsula Core, and the Palo Alto Stanford NAACP. She's lived in Palo Alto since 1964. She came here with her late husband, Ralph Libby, who was a reference librarian. And if there's anybody who's thinking about doing documentation of the civil rights movement in Palo Alto and around the Stanford community, Jean would be an important person to interview for her experiences with CORE and the NAACP. She got her education at UC Berkeley. Her thesis was Mean to Be Free, John Brown's Black Nation campaign. And she continued with a master's in ethnic studies from San Francisco State University and published From Slavery to Salvation, the autobiography of Reverend Thomas W. Henry of the AME Church. And I love this last comment that Jean makes. She says, my elder years are supposed to be wrapping up these projects. I won't let you, though, will I? But there are always new avenues to explore, especially in cooperation with others who enjoy the research journey. And as I say, the research never ends. So thank you all, and we'll begin with you, Dr. Cheers.
Like it was said, I came to San Jose in 2006 after 4 years at the University of Mississippi, teaching photojournalism, and a year at Auburn, and then before that, 30-plus years at Ebony Magazine, stationed in Chicago, D.C., Africa, Europe. And what I found in all of that was one word: community. Wherever I would go, not only in the foreign places, but even down south. I love to go down south. I was born in St. Louis, but I was raised down south. You know, when you're growing up, 60s, right? Your parents want to get rid of you during the summer, so they put us on a train and send us down south to our kinfolk. And that's where, I guess, as a young kid, I just began to observe. And that's how all this stuff came together over the years. And then in high school, I met Gordon Parks, who became not only a mentor, but later a friend, somebody who even now, even though he passed in 2006, a lot of my work, if not all of my work, is still connected to him and what he did. and how his work still speaks. You can pick up, I mean, I go on eBay and buy all the old Life magazines that have his photo essays in them. And I still study them. I use them in class. It was mentioned real quick that I'm working in Paris. I'm doing a Paris project where I'm reimagining and retracing, to a degree, Gordon's footsteps. He was in the Paris Bureau of Life magazine, 1949, 1951, shooting Paris fashions. And, you know, I'm just uncovering so much stuff. I'm about to make my third trip back there June 4th, and we'll be there most of the summer, and then back again later this year and next year. But back to community. It's something about this on my shoulder and walking around the streets of any community that opens up doors that keys don't. You don't even have to say anything for the most part. I just walk around with this and ooh-wee, you know, and people want to get to know me, and I appreciate that. And I start to ask questions that probe beyond what you just see walking past them. And that's really what this slideshow that I put together kind of demonstrates. After this George Floyd piece, it gets into, and as I was working on this presentation, going through 16 years of things that I've done in San Jose and at San Jose State. I see Carly Lowe there from our archives department. I'm going to be worrying the you-know-what out of her because I've been asked to begin to go through this stuff and try to do a handoff when I retire in about 5 years or less, good Lord willing. But it's been a journey. And like I said, I'd like to go behind the scenes, and you'll see some stories here, and we'll talk about it later if we have time, where I've gone beyond what I see and get into a visual narrative at a deeper level.
The protesters are taking the tear gas canisters and throwing them back at the police officers. That is the sound of a flashbang grenade. You have a group of probably 10 protesters who are just standing strong, arms up, right in front of the police.
We're here peacefully. I'm here, giving my hands up, showing my hands up. My hands are up, right? My hands are up.
Like I said, I just love to observe and pick up moments. Gordon Parks called them moments without proper names. I've done 2 documentaries so far on Antioch Baptist Church. That's called a dial house view using the VR camera, 360 camera. I walked into a black barber shop near campus about 10, 11 years ago. All I needed was a haircut, but I found much more. Again, it's more than just cutting heads. But it goes even deeper. Not only the free haircuts, but backpack giveaways and food giveaways, and again, cutting the homeless. Imagine that after being on your feet all day and then doing this. Then I ran across Aaron, and I just asked him a question. He didn't have a dad, but he wanted to be a dad to his young son. These guys donate hundreds of hours, if not thousands, during the football season to get back to the community. This is really fascinating to me about the aging population of San Jose. And I ran into Clythea Felix. Just started talking to her. Found out she was a caregiver for her mother. And she let me on the inside. I spent 2 years. Sometimes it's very painful what her mother would say to her. wouldn't eat, seemed always sad. Clara also babysat her granddaughter. At her hair salon 5 days a week and would babysit in between clients. Get a break, she would pray with a client, gave her strength. After celebrating her mom's 90th birthday, she passed away not too long after that. And Clara wanted me to be there to document that. I talked to her the other day. A lot of people didn't know about Bob. Carly Lowe's learning something about Bob Ellington. But his volunteer work was amazing. His wife's family were part of the founders of San Jose, Antioch Baptist Church. And Bob, of course, was the nephew of Duke Ellington. I was in Ghana when Bob passed. And I just flew back 7,000 miles to San Jose because I wanted to cover his funeral. And then lastly, I ran across this 14-year-old kid who was in trouble a lot. And his family and the school had given up on him. Everybody except for the community. And I always noticed that he rarely smiled, and he told his social worker that if he could just have a milkshake, it would make him happy. And it did. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
How can we see your documentaries?
Oh, gosh, ma'am, they're...
How can we see your documentaries?
Create TV ran a lot of them. Some of them are on YouTube. They're out there. The first one at Antioch won an Emmy, and I know that's still out there. You know, I'm probably the worst promoter of my own work, you know, but because there's so much work to do, I just go from one to the next to the next to the next, you know. If they show up. Yeah. Anybody else?
No, we're going to Google you. Yeah.
You said what, ma'am?
We're going to Google you.
Don't, please don't. It's called alimony. No, I'm sorry. I'm joking.
One real quick question. How, as a teacher, how do you, I mean, a lot of people in the room are educators. What do photographs and photography and photojournalism bring to teaching, and how would you suggest we use those? Because, you know, I'm moved by the images, and I always use photographs, but I don't know if I'm using them correctly or with the photographer's eye.
That's just it. You don't need a photographer's eye. What do young people use every day? Right? I'm getting ready to take a whole bunch of students to Paris next summer. And a lot of the projects that we do now, ooh, that's too much. I don't want to learn all that. Okay, fine. What do you use? They use this. You know, my way of teaching is to meet the students where they are. Those that want to obviously go on to the DSLR camera and so forth and so on, you know, I take them there. But I know professional photographers who have books that they've used their iPhones or smartphone cameras, you know. So meet them where they are. I did a project a few years ago where I wanted to reimagine Harlem. If you've been there in the past 10 years, you'll see, Lord have mercy, you know, you can't even recognize it anymore. Yes, the Apollo's there, but a lot of the places, the Lenox Theater and all these places, richness of Harlem, it's gone, it's gentrified. And I wanted to capture some of that. And so I was able to take 6 San Jose State students, and I partnered with 2 alternative high schools from Manhattan, 12 out of each school. Walking down the hall, journalism, it just hit me. Call Apple. I got the guy on the phone. Less than a week later, I had 24 phones in my office. And we went, I went early, taught them the basics of composition. The students joined me. The Studio Museum of Harlem gave us space. We went out throughout the community in Harlem for 3 or 4 days and documented it, edited it, did an exhibition. And the Harlem schools raised the money and brought their kids to San Jose State and unveiled the exhibition. Brother must be doing something right, you know? Yeah. And then they brought me back to New York, and we did the same thing at a gallery in New York. You know, it really, I tell my students all the time, how do you spell laceration, educators? Quickly, laceration. Quickly, come on, man. No. C-U-T, keep it simple. Y'all have a good day. Thank you.
Your students are very lucky, by the way. And now we're going to hear from Jan Adkins, who's going to talk about documenting. We're going to go a little further back in the past and regarding her work documenting San Jose and other African-American history in the Bay Area.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Batiste Adkins, and I consider myself a sort of a historian by interest. I love history. I've always loved history. History actually was my minor. But as an educator, I find that it's almost impossible to teach English if you can't somehow link literature with history. Kids want to know, well, what happened when? So anyway, I found a couple of interesting quotes that I like to think about as I think about the need to document history. So Marcus Garvey once said, "A people without the knowledge of their past, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." That is so true. If you don't understand your past, you're focusing on one particular aspect, but you don't know where it really comes from. And then Maya Angelou believed that the more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. So I had an interesting experience when I was an educator, a high school educator in 2008. My high school students said to me, I'm teaching John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, right? My students said, okay, well, when they arrived in California, what were black people doing during that time? I said, oh, good question. Well, I didn't even have an answer. I said, well, let's look, let's see further. What does John Steinbeck say about black people? Well, you know, it's not going to say anything. And so then, but the kids were serious. So I said, okay, don't worry. I'll come back in a week. I'm going to do the research for you, but let's move on and read this book. Well, they weren't happy. They wanted to know who lived in California during that time. You know, where did they live? What kind of, what did they do? They had all these questions, and so I had to begin to go back and do the research. And that's when I started writing about looking at literature and prose and researching the black newspapers. That's where I started. I said, okay, well, let's see, what were black people doing? Let's read the black newspapers and find out what articles are written about the community. And so that was my quest. That's when my journey began, and I began researching about the black community. So I've written 3 books. The 3 books are African Americans of San Francisco, African Americans of Monterey, and African Americans of San Jose and Santa Clara County. And those were published through Arcadia Publishing Company, the Images of American series. Doing the research, I began to ask myself, okay, first of all, who were the early black pioneers? When did people of African heritage begin migrating to California? When did they begin migrating? That was a when question. Who were these early pioneers, and where did they come from? And so one of the things I found out is that they began migrating to California as early as 1776. I'm like, wait a minute, isn't that the signing of the, America was independent in 1776, but what do we know? Well, what happened is that the Pueblo was established in San Jose. And these were Afro-Mexicans that came to San Jose. I found a statistic that said 26% of the population, of the residents living in the Pueblo, the first city in California, happened to be people of African heritage, Afro-Mexicans. I thought, well, that's interesting. I also found out that many came with explorers, and they came as workers and laborers on the ships. Many came as farmers, and they came in the Pueblo, of course, to raise the crops and to farm the land. Some came with priests. Father Juniper Serra brought Alexo Niños to Monterey Bay. And he was one of called him Cocker. Well, he was a worker on the ship, a labor. But there is an actual gravesite at the Presidio in Monterey of Alexo Niño's grave. And Father Juniper Serra prayed over and conducted the funeral. He was a black man. And some migrated from the free states. Well, we know that for sure. But we also, what we didn't know, is that some came as slaves. Some came as slaves. So I thought California was a free state. Well, yes, but slave owners were able to bring their slaves into California, and they maintained them in California and made them live in California on the farms and helped to build their homes and helped to mine. The miners were slaves. And so many found their freedom, though. Many were able to find their freedom through working at night and during off hours, and they were able to pay the money to the slave owner and were able to find their freedom. And then many came as free people. So here are a few interesting facts. This is a little quiz to see if you know your history. No. Let's see. So I just want to share with you what I discovered. What did I discover? Just a few things about San Jose. So anyway, there's the chart on the screen there. That's the actual Pueblo land in 1775. Several Afro-Mexican Puebloans helped to establish, and that's the plot. And this information is available down at San Pedro Square. And there's another map of the San Jose land too. Well, who was one of the most significant persons of African heritage in San Jose happened to be William Cassie, Peter William Cassie. And he's very significant because he was a deacon. He was deaconized by the church, the Episcopal Church, Trinity Episcopal Church in San Jose, and Jean's going to talk to you a little more about that. And but what he did was he established the first 2 schools. So the St. Phil's Mission was established by the church, by Trinity Episcopal Church. However, William Cassie, in the evenings, during the day when people were out working, kids were going to school, he established a school. The very first school was established there at St. Phil's Mission. And that was in 1868. And he's also very important because he also established a secondary school, which is called the Fixonian Institute. And this institute was housed right in the Bascom building. And so he was very important for that. But before that, he also helped to establish schools in San Francisco, what was called the Colored School in San Francisco. And he also was very instrumental in starting what was called the Colored Convention, which was established to help after the Civil War. Well, actually it started before the Civil War, but after the Civil War to ensure that black men were able to vote. So we have William Cassie. This next picture is just a photograph of the school. the school that he helped establish. So one thing I thought was really important is that the school was not just for black kids, but the school was for black, Native Americans, Native children rather, and Asian children who could not attend public schools. All non-white kids were not able to attend public schools. But in 1878, the public schools were desegregated, were segregated in 1878, and kids were able to attend schools throughout. African Americans also started local newspapers. And the local newspapers, the Pacific Appeal, Mirror of the Times, these newspapers were started in the 1850s and 1860s in San Francisco, but many of the newspaper workers would travel down to San Jose, would write stories about what they found, what was different things of interest in San Jose, and these were published in the San Francisco newspapers. So when I was doing my research back in 20 years ago, I guess, I was reading the newspapers, and it was so interesting to read about San Jose and some of the progress that was made in San Jose. And those newspapers are still available today in various reading rooms and different libraries. All of my information comes from primary sources or secondary sources available through the libraries. I included Mary Pleasant, who was a mother of civil rights, here because she led the abolitionist movement to help free many of, to help to provide the legal assistance to many who were seeking their freedom. So many slaves who needed freedom had to have a lawyer, and it was Mary Pleasant's and others who helped who are abolitionists to help to make that possible. In San Jose, in our own library, San Jose Library, the MLK Library, today you can find the work of Edmona Lewis. And her work was first purchased in 1873, and it's on display today at the library. So, why is it important for us to document ourselves? Well, Carol Moseley Braun, who was the very first African-American female U.S. Senator, said, once said, defining myself as opposed to being defined by others is one of the most difficult challenges I face. We've always been defined by others, but it's important for us to go out and define ourselves and to document our history. And I love what I heard earlier today. I think you mentioned in your speech, that Bill, that you saw references to slavery, but you didn't quite know there wasn't a backstory. That is so important, so that we need to find out what are the stories. We need to document those stories. We need to make it a part of history. When I began previewing history books, our information about how we lived, and not just the black community, but all non-white communities, non-Eurocentric communities, this information is missing. And it needs to be told from our point of view, because we can add the nuances and we can talk about, we're talking about the black church. You know, it's more than just a building somewhere. The black church actually was the hub of the community. And so it's really important for us to tell our stories and to share. Thank you.
The title is Black and White Together, Abolitionists at Trinity Episcopal Church in San Jose, California, 1860 to 1866. And this is the sign outside Trinity Church. It's been prepared for the Community Day today, and I thank you very much for allowing me to share this research with you. The congregation was started by the Reverend William Ingraham Kipp, and he was a well-liked Episcopal priest in Albany, New York. And perhaps he was too well-liked because they decided that he should be moved. And he was asked by the hierarchy to accept assignment to Baltimore. So what Reverend Kipp, who refused the assignment, saw was active commercial slave trading on the streets of Baltimore. People in chains were fastened together and placed in pens that were properly called jails, and the trauma of family separation. It was very gratifying that citizens in Baltimore today are working on truthfully telling these stories. So the position of missionary bishop of California was created for him. Perhaps some were hoping it was too far away for him to cause controversy. He was very successful in creating missions, and he wanted to establish missions for African Americans and Chinese. By 1860, he was officially the Bishop of California, and the diocese headquarters are in San Francisco. He is known for building Grace Cathedral at the top of Nob Hill, which continues to be in progressive leadership in the entire community. Many of the European American men in the first congregation were leaders in the government of San Jose. And they're meeting at the time, November 1860, it's the time of the election of Abraham Lincoln. The office of the assessor in San Jose had the most power. And like today, the assessor was elected. So the first two assessors, Charles Allen and William R. Davis, were part of the new Episcopal Church vestry. And there was a Judge William Daniels who had the title due to agricultural competitions, and he was one of the innovators who developed fruits in what became the Valley of Heart's Delight. Now, white church women were eager to acquire the accoutrements necessary for worship on the second floor of San Jose's first city hall. A news account in December 1860 notes they were making crafts to use in fundraising for the church structure. The new congregation provided social contact and the chance to practice their England-based cultural heritage. Moses Schallenberger was on the first successful overland journey to the West Coast. He spent the winter of 1844 alone guarding the wagons at age 17 while the rest of the group struggled west, returning for him in the spring. His interview on that experience is in the Stanford University Special Collections, who are hosting today's conference. Now, Owen Doremus was a well-known stained glass creator in New Jersey and New York, and there were 18 windows ordered for the church building, which was completed in 1863. And he used the opaque method of painting on top of glass, then fusing it with heat. The translucid method that we are familiar with now was invented just at the time of his death, 1878. Now, 15 of the 18 windows are extant. We believe that this is the largest Doremus collection in the country, don't we? Yes. My friend Bonnie Montgomery from church is here, so ask her for some support here and there. Now, Elisha Crosby was a constitutional founder of California whose family in central New York were close to the Abolitionist Senator Samuel Seward. In 1850, the papers declaring that California was state were carried through the tropics of Panama and Nicaragua by his niece, Mary Helen Crosby. She is famous for hiding the papers inside her umbrella and then trekking through the torrents with the umbrella closed. She was assisted by Major Samuel Hensley, a gold rush entrepreneur who had gotten rich by steamships carrying goods around between Alviso and San Francisco and the Sacramento Delta. They married and are key to the founding of Trinity Episcopal Church on land that was part of their estate, as well as funding construction and furnishings. Now, in 1853, Elisha Crosby purchased land that is now Barron Park, Matadero Creek, and the Stanford Business Park, which is just beyond the football field from where we are meeting right now. And he called it Mayfield Farm. And the name continued until, for the small settlement, until Leland Stanford built the university and the growing town was named Palo Alto. Crosby's transactions were constantly volatile, including the last duel fought in San Jose in 1859, in which his younger brother Samuel was killed, and it was over Mayfield real estate. So what is of particular interest to the abolitionist story is that when Abraham Lincoln was elected president at the time of Trinity's founding, he called on Elisha Crosby to be a special ambassador to Central America carrying his proposed emancipation plan. And the plan, involving payments to both liberated slaves and their owners, was designed by Seward. Now, this plan is often dismissed and called absurd and impractical and all this, but I think if you read it, you might find it of interest if you're interested in political history of emancipation. The family included other abolitionists. Crosby's parents and his sister, who was a year older than Mrs. Hensley and was also named Mary Helen Crosby, emigrated to Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. That was the abolitionist center of the first battles of the American Civil War, known as Bloody Kansas. They are all buried in Lawrence on fertile grounds for future research. Now, the great-grandfather of Reverend Peter Williams Cassie, the first African-American to be ordained to the Episcopal clergy west of the Mississippi, his great-grandfather was Peter Williams Sr., and he was enslaved by the St. John Methodist Church in New York City. He purchased himself from the Methodists in 1796, forming with other African Americans the new denomination known as African Methodist Episcopal Zion. And his grandfather, again a namesake, the Reverend Peter Williams Jr., was born while Sr. was still enslaved, but his mother was an indentured servant, and so people were assigned to slavery depending on the condition of the mother. Therefore, Peter was born free. So Reverend Peter Williams Jr. was the first black Episcopal priest in the state of New York, and he was a leader of early abolition groups such as the Free African Society and a founder of the first African-American periodical, Freedom's Journal. So Trinity's Peter William Cassie was the son of the daughter of Reverend Peter Williams Jr. and Joseph Cassie, who was a West Indian immigrant who became quite wealthy in Philadelphia, as well as active in abolition. We know about the life of the Cassie family because of the autograph album kept by his mother, Amy Williams Cassie, that is preserved and published by the Library Company of Philadelphia. And so visitors would write or draw in these albums when they were calling. And visitors to the Cassie family home in Peter's youth included Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote an original poem in her book. I can't say enough good things about the Library Company of Philadelphia, and I hope you'll want to look these up because they have 3 of them preserved entirely online. Joseph Cassie passed away in 1848 when Peter was 18, and his mother remarried the Massachusetts abolitionist Charles Lennox Remond in 1850. And we know about her life and values from their ward, who was valedictorian of the otherwise white high school. Amy passed away in 1856, making Charlotte Fortin very lonely in the austere household. And she wrote about Amy in her diaries that are famous for her teaching career in the South Sea Islands, South Carolina Sea Islands during the Civil War. And Peter began a barber business like his father when he emigrated to California about 1853. And he married the sister of the wife of his friend Alfred White, who moved to San Jose in 1857. Now there is a history of the Underground Railroad that was collected by Delilah Beasley, in her book based on primary sources, who says that Peter Cassie and a Mrs. White, it has to be Rebecca White, Alfred's husband and his wife's sister, who was the Mrs. White, who was involved in the Underground Railroad here in Santa Clara County. So Alfred White had a successful barbershop at the Azure Hotel. And the sisters and the mother were ladies' nurses. And this occupation moved generationally among women. And as evidence shows in the San Jose Census and city directories, that this occupation of ladies' nurse, of women who were married to barbers or their daughters, was passed on. So there was a sense of surprise, and this came when I was working with Jan Adkins on her research, for African Americans in San Jose. And so you never know what's going to happen when you're helping somebody. I really recommend being cooperative with people because you can find all kinds of things. And so the catalyst was support for the secondary school that she described, which was established with Peter Cassie's leadership in 1862. And so finding out that these people, there were 6 families of African Americans in the original church congregation, occurred because of the census, which names people by race or color. Because when you look at the church records, which is also a primary source of all the baptisms and the marriages and the burials, they didn't name race or color in it. I had to correlate these with the signatories of the Constitution of the Phoenixonian Institute and the census in order to find them. So there were annual pilgrimages to the graves of Peter Cassie's wife, Annie, and her mother, Henrietta Lockwood, and they were conducted by the Reverend Jerry Drino of the Episcopal Church. And he raised funds to have markers on the graves and organized a Cassie family reunion in 2015. Now, there were a lot of people who were researching Peter Williams Cassie, including Jan, including Susan. And so my question became, who were the congregation who supported the ordination of an African American to the Episcopal clergy in 1866? And Jan pointed out that the white members and clergy had a frequent common marker: nativity in central New York State. You remember when you did that? Yeah, that's what caused this talk here now. Thank you. Yes. And it also resonated because that's my birthplace too. And my Yankee ancestors resembled this group in many ways. And I was welcomed at Trinity and found a church home. And it soon became apparent that not only was the congregation diverse, they had deep roots in the neighborhoods and communities of San Jose. Julie Pfeiffer is a retired librarian of the San Jose Children's Librarian. She's photographed at the close of the first concert performed on the New Carillon, and the manual keyboard is almost unchanged since the 14th century. The bells are connected by cables and cranks and springs, which the bell ringer pounds with their fists in order to move the clappers. Now, there are 3 manually played carillons in the Bay Area: Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in San Jose, the UC Berkeley Campanile, and, yes, be more specific. Hoover Tower, yes. All right, those are the three. There's one more in Northern California and one at Santa Barbara, and that's it, of the manually played consoles. Now, Lorenzo Carrillo Arciniega was baptized into the original Spanish-speaking congregation at Trinity, and this was during the 1990s, and now he serves on the present vestry. Bilingual services are held at Trinity for nearly 30 years, and with an autonomous congregation that is connected with the church as a congregation. Now, in the lower right center is Philip Hanasaki, a San Jose State faculty member who passed away last month. He has a 120-year family history in Santa Clara County. He and his brother Daniel Hanasaki told me about their maternal grandmother who emigrated with her husband and small daughter from Japan, that was their mother, in 1922. The small daughter was their mother. And they were part of a group of Anglican Christians seeking religious freedom, just like the New England Puritans and Pilgrims. And so Hideko Ota was known as a Mogo woman, having strong modern views. She believed that the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote in the United States, which had just been passed, would apply to her. She was greatly disappointed with the racist exclusion acts that reached into the 1940s with the incarceration of Japanese Americans along with their parents during World War II. After the war, his grandfather on his father's side developed seeds for lettuce that would travel with refrigeration. And his mother became a Mogo woman herself in 1954 when she petitioned the U.S. government on behalf of her father-in-law based on his service in the military in the Spanish-American War. She won redress and reparations for him. Phil's MA thesis at San Jose State University is about the emotional toll of the concentration camps, which he remembered being there as a small child. But he's best known for his skills in remedial standard English in a successful program among athletes whose careers and teams he avidly followed throughout his life. Now, there's an interesting reason that Trinity's church, which was built in 1863, is the oldest house of continuing worship, because we all remember that there's, the Spanish were there for hundreds of years before, and they built the missions and all that. But the Trinity, the year that after the Trinity Church was completed, all the major earthquakes have taken those churches down because they're made of adobe and bricks, and they've all crumbled a couple of times and been rebuilt. So this church, Trinity, which is on the corner of, it's on 81 North 2nd Street, is built by a ship's captain who fastened the boards with pegs rather than nails, and so when the earthquakes occur, the building rocks. The only damage that occurred came in the 1989 quake when the steeple of the Presbyterian church that you see in the Edward Maybridge photo here fell on the roof, and that damaged Trinity's roof. So I'm glad to have here my bibliography. That's been a great pleasure to compile these works. And notice that Jan Adkins' book is a part of it, very essential resource in understanding, and also these primary resources. And I'd also like to give credit and acknowledgement to the ministers and the officers and vestry of my church And it became my church because the people welcomed me so much, so I just stayed. And yeah, I know it's been hard. It's been hard during COVID, but I think after this experience, I'll be ready. Thank you very much.
Well, let's once again thank Jan and Jean and also Dr. Cheers for his presentation. And this is open for questions. I hope that you heard things that you didn't know about from these presentations, and please feel free to comment and ask questions, but I want to start out with some questions myself. One of the things that one of the reasons your research is so significant, starting with Jean, about the church, but also the abolitionist community in San Jose, is because San Jose wasn't necessarily populated by a whole lot of abolitionists. And somebody mentioned the Bascom Center earlier. One of the things that I found in my research, looking at the first court case in California related to an enslaved person. It was in San Jose in the old Pueblo, just on the cusp of becoming a state in California, becoming a state in the United States. But the pioneer families and the well-known names of the people who established San Jose were almost all enslavers. Almost all of them owned people. Bascom, certainly. And that is in addition to what gets left out, as you were saying, and people have been saying all day, so-called marginalized communities, communities of color, African American history gets left out. But this also gets left out when we hear this, histories of a place like San Jose, and nobody is really taught that the so-called pioneers it was very casual and it was very widespread, enslavement was.
James Reed. James Reed.
Exactly. So sometimes it was one person or two people or, the cook or whatever, but it was very common. So the community around Trinity Episcopal Cathedral was actually unique, and they were resisting the dominant culture in this early history of a place like San Jose. Yeah, very important. So the significance of abolitionists in so many of these years you were talking about were at the height of the Civil War itself. So were you going to say something?
Well, I was shocked to find out the amount of slavery that existed. And when I started my research, I had my professor from San Jose State, and I said, well, I want to look at slavery. She said, oh, no, there's no slavery in California. I said, no, wait a minute. So then she said, no, you're not going to write about slavery in California. So then but I had all this research. I said, look, here it is right here. You have Tim Jackson. We have all these people. Archie Lee case. There was slavery. And then when she actually saw the facts, she said, oh, my gosh, yes, you're going to have to include that. And so, I think that people had this notion that this was a free state, and people came and they never thought, how did black people, how did these people migrate, and how did they live and exist? And then when you look at the census data, which Jean was so wonderful and working with me on the census data, remember we saw labor, and then here's the catch, mulatto. Mulatto. See, that was before. I wouldn't use black, we would say mulatto, and then labor. And then you would see the family members had a first and last name, but the slave didn't have a last name. You would just have, Madison, mulatto, And so there were ways that we were able to identify who in fact were slaves. And if you go back and look at traditionally how the Census Bureau recorded it, that's how slaves were recorded. And they were all grouped together at the end of the family, And so, yeah, you actually have to look at the census records.
Well, and that's the key, is they were in white households.
Exactly.
Generally, if you look in California in the past censuses, censi, I don't know what it is. that is a key way to determine what's going on. If there are African Americans listed in a white household, before 1865, and sometimes after, too. But before 1865, before emancipation, you are talking about people who were enslaved.
And there's so many, and you can tell, okay, first name, mulatto, okay. And then later on, you may not find that person listed with that family at all. And so there was an effort with the abolitionists to try to help support the slaves to find their freedom. And so and support them with legal representation and different things. And there were lots of organizations that exist, but
black
they were
people,
abolitionists.
Basically were the work of black people.
Yeah.
That was true in California and in the nation. And I just can't stress enough how unusual a community like Trinity Episcopal was. Generally, from what I have been able to find, there were many people who professed anti-slavery sentiments in California history. I mean, white people. Fremont. You could just start listing them. You knew they were anti-slavery, but it's impossible to find in the record relationships with the black people who we know were leading abolitionist work. That's number one. There was no. And number two, in black accounts, they tell you who the white people are they're working with. Yeah. And so it was a pretty rare thing for a white community, including a religious community, to be that affiliated with abolitionism. And what we forget today is that abolitionism, like civil rights in the modern day time, was a black movement. William Lloyd Garrison himself said famously that, he was following the lead of the black people who had been resisting this for a long time, and that was true in California.
I want to add that in San Francisco there was a white church. It's in my San Francisco.
Thomas Starr King.
Yeah, Starr King, exactly. He led the abolitionist movement, but along with the black community.
Thomas Starr King is the one white person in the 19th century that we know, not only because of the general record, but because his black comrades talk about him. He spoke in black churches. He was in black spaces. He was identified by the people that were leading the anti-slavery movement as a co-resistor. But there's no one else I can think of who is prominent, who may have, like I said, Fremont or so, who may have been anti-slavery, who was identified that way in the record. So Thomas Starr King, black people loved Thomas Starr King in California, just like they loved John Brown. You put that together about Mrs. White in Delilah Beasley. Jean mentioned a book that is one of the Bibles of California African American history, that it's not possible to study or know this history without familiarizing yourself with Delilah Beasley's book, which was published in 1919, Negro Trailblazers of California. She traveled around. She was a journalist who wrote for about 10 years for the Oakland Tribune a column called Negro Activities of the Negro, And she took it on herself and paid her own money and traveled around the state meeting with mostly people who had, black people who had come to California during the gold rush. And she consulted primary sources. And she was the first person actually to publish an article about slavery in California in the Journal of Negro History in one of its first issues. But she does have this mysterious little sentence when she's writing about San Jose, about Peter Cassie and these known abolitionists and a Mrs. White, who she says went to physically rescue. That the nature of the Underground Railroad in California was that people often would find out where people were being held captive. And sometimes they would talk to them and say, you know, do you want to leave? And then they'd come back and they'd take them. That was one of the most common things. And sometimes it was just enough to get let loose in a city like San Francisco or in the wilderness, you know, in a more rural area. Sometimes people ran or got on a ship. But that was the main way that the Underground Railroad worked, was people were physically rescued primarily by black people. And this Mrs. White, I never knew who that was, but you are surmising based on your research, and I know you're right.
She has to be, yes. It was Reverend Jerry Drino who found her. She's also buried at Oak Hill. And then things started coming together. But the thing about Mrs. White, her mother, and her sister's mother, was a free African-American woman, head of household in Charleston, South Carolina in 1830. And she has in the household a 1-year-old enslaved infant female. And I believe that was Rebecca. And Annie was not born until 1831 or 1832, whereas Rebecca was born in 1829. And I believe that Rebecca was enslaved.
Any questions? Yes.
This one for Jan. Yeah,
Okay.
One quick question. Wait. I'm so loud anyway. Jan, you talked about William Cassie and the schools. And I wondered, with the schools for black children, how long, do you know how long they existed? And did they keep good records of the students?
Well, the schools lasted until about 1878 when desegregation happened. And what happened there is that the parents were paying their taxes and felt that their kids were, however, their kids were denied access to education. So then what happened is that they challenged the school board and said, you know, our kids, if our kids can't go to school, then we shouldn't have to pay taxes. We should be able to use our money to pay to support our schools. So then the school board, and this happened throughout the state, they began to deal with that issue.
Well, the law changed. Yeah. It was a state law. Okay. Education law changed in California. But from the statehood, the law forbade African American and Chinese and what they called digger, they meant Native American children. They were forbidden by law, state law, from attending public schools. Then, because there were campaigns, particularly led by black parents around the state, the education policy changed again, and it allowed black children to attend separate schools. So separate but equal was California law for a long time. Jan mentioned the convention, the Convention of Colored Citizens of California. Education was a huge priority to black people in California starting in the 19th century. And that was, they had constant campaigns. They were constantly meeting with the legislature. Once they were allowed to testify in court, they sued, their famous lawsuits. Actually, the state Supreme Court didn't decide that black children were allowed to go to white schools until 1890, when Edward Weisinger in Tulare County brought suit, when they wouldn't let his son go to a school in Tulare County. That was the policy changed. But on the ground, the reality of segregation never quite changed in California schools.
But the school board in San Jose was in 1878 decided to integrate the schools.
That's a good point, because it did change.
That was because of the money, because parents wanted, and they felt okay, and they,
Yeah,
schools were integrated at that point.
local parents were able to sway.
Exactly.
They were political, because Oakland actually changed in 1870. I think that Natalie's going to make us stop.
Stay longer.
Because I know I saw another question, but we'll wrap it up now. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
you. Wonderful panel. Thank you.